50,000 voices roar. The sand is bright with sunlight and darker stains. In the center, a woman is led into a hollow bronze bull, an engineered prop, her limbs bound, the crowd expecting spectacle. The bull moves, the mechanism groans, and a mounted animal is forced into a staged coupling meant to entertain and humiliate. Poets recorded it, pamphlets laughed, a city cheered. What they did not know was how the apparatus, the animal, and the human body would leave a physical record beneath that applause. Today we read that record. Today we take the implements, the bones, and the stains left in amphitheaters and ask, what do the tools of Roman torture and spectacle actually leave behind? What traces can modern forensics and archaeology recover, and how do those traces change our picture of ancient violence? If you want more unfiltered history and forensic reveals, like and subscribe. The Roman arena was not merely theater in the aesthetic sense, it was an engineered system of public violence and political messaging. The munus began as a private obligation to the dead and evolved into state-funded festivals, venationes exhausted men and beasts, gladiatorial combat staged as civic ritual, and naumachie that flooded arenas to reenact naval slaughter. Emperors used these events to consolidate power and to translate imperial resources into a spectacle that bound citizens by ritualized terror and entertainment. Contemporary commentators recorded both the scale and the moral tension. Seneca warned that spectacle corrupted sensibilities. Cassius Dio tallied imperial expenditures as proof of political theater. Pliny lamented the ecological cost of exotic animal hunting and transport. Numbers in ancient texts are often rhetorical, but the logistical scale is undisputed. Titus's inaugural games and Trajan celebrations required tens of thousands of animals and thousands of combatants across months. To stage that continuity required supply chains, holding pens, kill mechanisms, and portable props, machinery that, by design, would leave material signatures. The forensic question is simple and stubborn. Engineering leaves marks. Bones, metal fittings, stone thresholds, and preserved sedimentary layers all archive repetitive systems of use. Our task is to read those archives carefully, to separate myth from material, and to identify what patterns of injury, wear, and residue tell us about standardized cruelty versus episodic violence. To do that, we must first define our evidence categories and methods. Broadly, 3 classes of physical evidence inform this inquiry: the osteological record, human and animal bones with trauma and taphonomic markers; the artifacts, tools, hooks, tridents, chains, and mechanical components with wear patterns; and chemical residues, organic traces on stone, metal, leather, or textile that could indicate blood, protein remnants, or lipid markers. Osteology is the foundation.
Perimortem trauma, injuries inflicted at or near the time of death, can be distinguished from postmortem damage by the absence of healing and by fracture patterns that reflect bone elasticity at the moment of force. Cut mark analysis, whether macroscopic or microscopic, allows us to infer the type of implement used. A serrated edge produces a different microstriation than a sharp thrusting instrument. A blunt force results in depressed radiating fractures. Under scanning electron microscopes, we see microchipping and striations that can be compared to experimental marks made with period-appropriate tools. But preservation biases exist. Acids in soil, trampling, and reuse of bones for secondary purposes can obliterate or mimic perimortem features. Interpretive caution is essential. Zoo archaeology reads the animal side of the ledger. Selective butchery marks, parallel cut patterns, and periosteal scraping can indicate whether animals were slaughtered for consumption or deliberately weakened for spectacle. Pathologies, stress markers, enamel hypoplasia, cortical bone thinning, can signal starvation or prolonged malnutrition. Tooth mark histology allows us to separate carnivore mauling from human-made trauma. Yet isolation of these signals in a multi-activity context like an amphitheater is difficult. Carcasses used for food, training, or spectacle can intermingle in deposits. Chemical residue analysis offers promise but carries limits. Heme-based colorimetric assays can indicate the presence of blood residues on stone or metal, but they are susceptible to false positives from plant peroxidases or soil contaminants. Proteomic approaches, mass spectrometry methods such as LC-MS-MS, can retrieve fragmentary protein signatures more specific to species or tissue type, but degradation over 2 millennia makes confident taxonomic assignments uncertain. Ancient DNA holds potential, but is contingent on exceptional preservation and is often indefinito for residues on porous surfaces exposed to weather. When invoking biomolecular methods, we will mark specifics as indefinito unless directly tied to peer-reviewed studies. We test these methods not to prove a sensational claim, but to assemble converging lines of evidence. When osteological trauma, artifact wear, and residue patterns cohere at a site, the inference that a particular rigging or a repetitive practice occurred becomes strong. When they do not, the narrative must be qualified. Our first case study concerns venations, the staged hunts that supplied much of the spectacle economy and drained the Roman appetite for exotic fauna. Market records and imperial ledgers speak of lions, elephants, bears, and giraffes shipped across seas and deserts. The Zoo Archaeological Archive tells a complementary story. Dr. Marcus Hale, zoo archaeologist. When we examine deposits from amphitheater contexts, the anatomical representation of species matters.
In a butchery assemblage intended for food, we expect a range of skeletal elements that reflect dietary processing: long bones, ribs, vertebrae removed and sometimes butchered locally. In a spectacle deposit, we often find a biased representation: cranial elements and limb bones bearing impact trauma or carnivore tooth marks consistent with live mauling. At sites adjacent to provincial arenas, analysts have documented patterns compatible with staged weakening. Long bones of large felids and bears sometimes show cortical thinning and healed stress lesions that suggest prolonged malnutrition or captivity-related stress. Parallel cut marks around joint articulations, appearing as repeated, similarly placed incisions, are consistent with the systematic rendering of tendons to immobilize an animal before release, or with butchery following death. In several cases, tooth pits on bone demonstrate multiple predator interactions, indicating animals were set to fight rather than to be humanely dispatched. Such patterns, combined with historical accounts of animals starved to increase ferocity, form a coherent inferential picture. But the interpretive line has limits. Starvation signals in bone are not instantaneous. They require weeks to develop, and their presence cannot alone prove intent. Moreover, scavenging by dogs and commingled food waste can produce similar signatures in refuse contexts. To strengthen the inference, we look for artifacts of capture and restraint: iron collars, ring studs embedded in masonry for tethering, and corrosion patterns on chains. Our second case returns to the human cost: damnatio ad bestias and staged myth reenactments. Literary sources described condemned people thrown to beasts or staged as mythic figures in reenacted deaths. Some of these episodes were crafted as moral lessons, others as humiliation. In the limited osteological assemblages attributed to amphitheater deaths, when careful excavation and context control are preserved, several consistent markers recur: puncture trauma to ribs and limbs consistent with tearing, deep punctures on cranial vaults that may reflect strikes from pointed instruments or concentrated animal bites, and periosteal reactions in bone adjacent to soft tissue injuries suggesting antemortem stress. Dr. Elena Rossi, forensic archaeologist. When we look at human remains in an amphitheater context, we first seek secure stratigraphic association. A skeleton found within an in-sand deposit sealed under a later floor is far more likely to represent occupational death than bones redeposited from elsewhere. Microscopic examination of cut marks can indicate whether a weapon was used to dispatch someone, what we call a finishing blow, versus injuries sustained from animal mauling.
In several carefully recorded contexts, patterns suggest staged killing methods: repeated, similarly oriented chop marks on vertebrae and long bones that align with the expected use of tridents or hooked poles; localized burning patterns on bones or calcined fragments, suggestive of execution devices involving flames or torches; and localized sets of perimortem fractures implying restraint. When we can match those osteological signatures to surviving artifacts, trident tips with bent pongs, anchor-like hooks with soil embedding consistent with repeated use, the forensic story grows stronger. But some crucial specifics remain, indefinito. For instance, the biochemical identification of blood on a bronze bull or on textile remains in an amphitheater rely on preservation conditions rarely met in open-air Mediterranean climates. If proteomic analysis on a conserved fragment demonstrated species-specific hemoglobin peptides, we would treat that as high-confidence evidence. Until then, many residue claims must be held as provisional. Alternate lines of evidence come from artifact wear patterns. Chains and collars recovered from municipal dumps show shear stresses and microabrasions consistent with repeated binding and tugging. Nets recovered in rare waterlogged contexts display fiber fraying patterns that experimental archaeology links to repeated use against resisting bodies. Materials science can bridge the gap from physical artifact to function. Dr. Lydia Chen, materials scientist. We examine striations under SEM to determine whether a metal edge was used primarily for slicing soft tissue or for cutting rope. The angle and microchipping pattern of an edge can tell us whether the tool was used aggressively, defensively, or in livestock processing.
Combined with residue sampling, this allows us to hypothesize tool function with greater confidence than artifact morphology alone. Our third case study interrogates the most theatrical of Roman entertainments, naumachia, or staged naval battles. Sources describe flooded basins and purpose-built reservoirs where mock naval engagements resulted in large numbers of deaths. Archaeology is less generous with intact naumachia complexes. Many are suggested by drainage features, levees, and basins in which ship timbers have been found. Where structural remains survive, they offer a forensic signature of organized mass death. When engineers flooded and drained amphitheaters or constructed basins for naval reenactment, they left behind hydraulic features, sluice gates, culverts, and layered deposits of silt. Mass deposits of disarticulated human and animal bone within these basins can indicate rapid depositional events consistent with mass drowning or slaughter. The taphonomic signature differs from long-term refuse. Bones show minimal weathering but widespread disarticulation, with a mix of human and animal remains in a single horizon.
Microscopic analysis of bone from such deposits sometimes reveals microabrasion consistent with water transport, while perimortem cut marks or embedded metal fragments in bone can suggest that violence occurred in a mixed context of combat and post-mortem processing. Ship timbers recovered from basins sometimes show repair patterns consistent with training exercises rather than commercial use, fastening marks repetitive in location, abrasion from oarlocks, and iron fittings bent in ways consistent with deliberate ramming. Each of these features alone is equivocal. Together, they indicate that naval spectacles were not simply theatrical mockery, but infrastructural operations with predictable material outcomes. Between these case studies, a pattern emerges. First, injuries and artifacts display standardization. Repeated cut mark orientations, similar wear on mechanical fittings, and recurring residue patterns suggest production line cruelty, tools made for a purpose, procedures repeated to prepare animals and people for spectacle, and props engineered to produce predictable sensory cues for spectators. Second, the orchestration required logistical infrastructure, holding pens, supply chains for exotic animals, and skilled craftsmen and cagemen to rig engines of cruelty. Third, the environmental footprint was measurable, species depletion in some regions, localized waste deposits, and the persistent imprint of construction projects on urban hydrology point to long-term consequences beyond any single show. These observations align with the testimonies of contemporaries. Cassius Dio commented on the expense and planning. Pliny worried about the loss of biodiversity as forests and steppes were stripped to supply beasts. Seneca, writing from moral outrage, argued the spectacles eroded civic virtue. Forensics does not replace those voices, it reframes them. Where ancient writers offer perception and moral judgment, material evidence supplies mechanisms and scale. We must, however, attend to methodological caution. Chemical residues degrade and often cannot be taxonomically resolved on porous surfaces without exceptional preservation. Osteological signatures can be obscured by post-depositional processes, scavenging, or later construction. Artifacts may be repurposed across contexts, their original function masked by secondary use. Therefore, our argumentative structure relies on convergence. The more independent lines of evidence point to the same operational pattern, the greater our confidence. One example of careful convergence arrives from a provincial amphitheater excavation, where archaeologists documented a sealed sand horizon containing both human and animal bone, a cluster of iron fittings, and a nearby waste pit with fragmented net weights. Microscopy showed parental striations on several ribs, comparable to experimental trident impacts. Proteomic sampling of a protected leather fragment returned indefinito signals, some evidence of heme-like peptides, but not a confident taxonomic assignment. When combined with the artifact distribution and the site's stratigraphy, the most plausible reconstruction is that of a staged killing accompanied by tools designed for restraint and mauling, though the precise sequence of events remains indefinito in its details. What emerges from the forensic synthesis is a disturbing clarity. Spectacle in Rome was engineered, routinized, and materially infrastructural. The physical signatures show practice, standardized tools, repeated trauma patterns, and residue clustering, rather than the chaotic, spontaneous violence of a mob. That observation reframes moral responsibility. These were not isolated excesses, but ordered institutions that required technicians, artisans, logistics managers, and political sanction to operate at scale. The amphitheater thus functioned as both theater and factory of violence, producing ritual outcomes whose effects extended into economics, ecology, and civic life. There is an ecological ledger as well. Demand for exotic animals, North African lions, Syrian bears, and North African elephants created pressure on regional faunas. Zooarchaeological surveys in several Mediterranean provinces document declines in species representation in contexts dated to the imperial period. Correlational evidence from hunting records and price surges in historical accounts correspond to the archaeofaunal record. The spectacle economy was not free, it required extraction that altered ecosystems and the livelihoods of people who depended on them. Confronting these facts raises an ethical question about spectacleship then and now. The forensic record restores anonymity to those who were reduced to props. Bones and artifacts force us to remember the lived materiality of suffering, to understand that cruelty left measurable marks on bodies and on the landscape. That empirical recovery can puncture romanticized narratives of gladiatorial honor or civic virtue. Forensics is not a revenge instrument, it is a tool for truth-telling, for assembling the empirical scaffolding that supports a sober moral assessment. There are limits to what we can claim. When we hypothesize the precise choreography of a staged rape described in a poem, we must restrain ourselves. Sexual violence is a category of crime that the archaeological record rarely names explicitly. We treat such episodes with clinical attention to evidence and with moral condemnation of the act itself, not with sensational description. Where skeletal evidence indicates sexualized violence, pelvic trauma of certain kinds, perimortem injury patterns, we describe it in technical terms and emphasize uncertainty unless corroborated by multiple independent lines of data. Conclusiveness here is unusual. Nuance is the norm. Methodological advances continue to push the envelope.
Environmental proteomics, careful microstratigraphic sampling, and experimental archaeology capable of reproducing expected wear patterns help test hypotheses. For instance, controlled experiments in which tridents are used against bone analogs under varied angles and velocities produce comparative microstriations that can be checked against archaeological marks. Similarly, captive space archaeology, the study of pens and holding installations, helps us understand how tethering left architectural signatures on masonry and soil compaction. Yet every analytic advance must be balanced by candid reporting of uncertainty. A suspected blood residue remains suspected until confirmed by robust proteomic or genetic evidence, and even then, taphonomic processes must be acknowledged. The political dimension is no afterthought. If spectacle functions as statecraft, then the material economy of entertainment is a form of governance. Public brutality operates as a message. The state controls life and death, it engineers consent, and it normalizes violence. Forensics unmasks the mechanics of that governance. It shows how public rituals were calibrated, down to tool design and animal management, to produce desired effects of awe, humiliation, and social cohesion under spectacle. Recognizing this institutional design is uncomfortable, but it is crucial for understanding the social fabric of Rome and for assessing how modern societies convert ritualized displays, military parades, televised trials, or other forms of mass spectacle into political currency. We must be careful here not to conflate ancient with modern governance. The purpose is analytical clarity, not polemic. As we close, return to the amphitheater sand. The tools, hooks, nets, trident tips, are not idle curiosities. They are the fingerprints of a system. The bones are not mute relics, but testimonial artifacts. Their microfractures and striations are the last forensic sentences of lives interrupted. Residues, when present and properly analyzed, are traces of contact, animal with metal, human with brass, blood with stone, that stitch together narratives the poets only partially reveal. What else does the sand keep? It keeps the outlines of industrial cruelty, the details of engineering choices made to maximize spectacle, and evidence of ecological depletion produced by a demand-driven market for animals. It keeps the imprint of institutional decisions that turned execution and entertainment into civic spectacle. If you found this investigation compelling, watch our next video where we will dive deeper into a single archaeological site, a provincial amphitheater with exceptionally preserved deposits, where researchers are testing proteomic approaches and experimental archaeology to refine our understanding of amphitheater practice. For now, the sand has spoken in fragments. Each fragment asks us to listen with methods that are rigorous, cautious, and ethically attuned.
Subscribe to follow the series as we let the material record speak, piece by piece, about the engineering of cruelty and the lives it consumed.